AIDS brings a response
Fight
from the
against
government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
Welcome to AIDS: The Lost Voices with me, William Hampson. In this series, we journey through the decades to explore how Britain reported on the AIDS pandemic. We'll delve into the newspaper archives from the 80s, 90s and noughties, unearthing individual stories that reveal the human experiences behind the headlines. Join me as we seek to understand the complexities of a crisis that reshaped lives and challenged societal perceptions. Ready? Let's go. Now, I should start by stating, despite the title of this episode being of many headlines in the newspapers at the time, the scope of this episode is not to establish or speculate whether the man you will come to hear about, David Carr of Manchester, is or is not the world's first AIDS patient, nor Britain's first AIDS patient for that matter, given that David Carr sadly passed away in 1959 at the age of 25. However, approximately 30 years after his death, his name and the mysterious cause of his death were thrust into the media spotlight amid speculation regarding whether David was indeed the world's first AIDS case. Now, I feel strongly that it is a pointless task to label and or seek out the first AIDS case because the number was forever changing. There is no benefit whatsoever in doing so, as the complexities of the disease and its history cannot be adequately captured through such narrow definitions. However, the evidence put before the doctors, scientists and medical journals regarding the perplexing circumstances surrounding David Carr's death in 1959 warrants serious consideration. First-hand accounts from those close to Carr, as well as the testimonies of medical professionals who treated him, provide invaluable insights that could elucidate the enigmatic factors contributing to his demise. Despite extensive examinations and the absence of definitive explanations at the time, the explanation of contemporary medical findings alongside historical testimonies may shed new light on the case. A thorough re-evaluation of both clinical data and personal narratives may help discern patterns or overlooked details that could clarify the cause of his untimely passing, enabling a deeper understanding of the complexities involved. So, let's take a look at how David Carr and his untimely death became thrust into the media spotlight, where this story broke in the Manchester Evening News, David's local newspaper, on the 6th of July 1990, where they ran the headline, AIDS Case Number 1 Keeps Secret, where they report, the identity of the Manchester man who was the world's first known AIDS sufferer will remain a mystery, scientists said today. The name of the mystery man was not known to researchers, and no further work will be done on the intriguing case of the former sailor who died in 1959 after being treated at Manchester Royal Infirmary. Dr. Gerald Corbett, principal clinical scientist at the Regional Health Authority's Virology Lab at Booth Hall Hospital, said that the painstaking 7-year research had been an exercise in archaeology. Until now, the earliest recorded case of AIDS were in the 1960s. The man, in his mid-20s, was admitted to Manchester Royal Infirmary in 1959, suffering from, quote, overwhelming pneumonia, end quote, herpes infection and ulcers. The case was so interesting that it was written up by 3 doctors in the Lancet in 1960 as having all the hallmarks of an immune deficiency illness. The case was brought to scientists' attention again after the discovery of the HIV virus, which leads to AIDS. But it was not until 1983 that techniques developed in the United States allowed analysis of tissues taken from the patient and stored at Manchester Medical School. Mr. Andrew Bailey, Senior Chief Medical Laboratory Scientific Officer, told how 4 samples were tested for HIV, along with control samples from another patient who also died in 1959. Scientists did not know which of the samples they were working on, yet the samples from the seaman, the sailor, came up positive. The results were, quote, as indicative as we can make them, end quote, of the presence of HIV, said Dr. Corbett. But very little is known of the man. He was a seaman, possibly in the Royal Navy, rumoured to have travelled to Africa, where cases of HIV were seen in Zaire as early as 1959. Dr. Corbett said that because of the different nursing and medical procedures, the period of development from infection to full-blown AIDS could have been shorter, 4 to 5 years instead of 8 to 10 years, at the time when the mystery man lived. He added there could have been sporadic cases of AIDS from this time until the infection reached epidemic proportions in the 1980s. And on the same day, the Cambridge Evening News ran the headline, AIDS linked to 1959 mystery, with the strapline, Sailor's death finally solved. and the article offers the following additional insight, where they report, a seaman who died of AIDS in 1959 may have served in the Royal Navy, doctors said today. They are working on the theory that he was infected with HIV, possibly while on shore leave in the tropics, several years before his death in Manchester. They stressed it was unlikely other people died of AIDS in Britain in the 1950s, although the virus may well have been present for a long time in other parts of the world. The 25-year-old seaman, who was single, died of severe pneumonia and cytomegalovirus infection, a form of herpes, long before AIDS was recognised officially in the 1980s. Until now, the earliest recorded cases of AIDS were in the 1960s. Dr. Trevor Stretton, consultant physician at Manchester's Royal Infirmary, one of the team who treated him, said, quote, "He was a very sick young man whom we could not diagnose. We knew that he had some nasty disease, the nature of which we did our best to track down, but it constantly eluded us." End quote. He said doctors reported the bizarre death in the Lancet in 1960, but it was not until AIDS was recognised more than 20 years later that they realised they might have seen one of the first cases. Dr. Gerald Corbett of the Virus Laboratory at Booth Hall Hospital, Manchester, said a revolutionary new technique of gene amplification confirmed the diagnosis. The technique, called PCR, found traces of HIV in tissue samples which had been stored in paraffin ever since the sailor died. The diagnosis would have been impossible before PCR was developed a few years ago. Then, 2 days later, on the 8th of July 1990, the independent newspaper interviewed Dr. Stretton, who treated David from the moment he was admitted to Manchester Royal Infirmary, and was one of 3 doctors to share their concerns in a Lancet paper, and now in the midst of the AIDS pandemic, believed David's death was due to AIDS. The independent newspaper ran the headline, "How the First AIDS Case Was Unravelled," where they report, Dr. Trevor Stretton has never forgotten the young man who walked haltingly into Manchester's Royal Infirmary in April 1959. He was, like the doctor himself, in his 20s, but he was very ill, and neither Dr. Stretton nor his older colleagues could fathom the cause of what appeared to be a unique disease. They watched him waste away, suffering from pneumonia, gingivitis, inflammation of the gums, and anal ulceration, until he died in September 1959. He actually died on the 31st of August 1959. He failed to respond to any treatment. The doctors thought he had tuberculosis, but were forced to abandon this and other diagnoses. His immune system appeared to have failed, but they had no idea why. What they did not and could not know was that in the permissive age before the legalization of homosexuality, the man was suffering from AIDS. Now confirmed, 31 years later, his was the world's earliest recorded case of the disease. According to Dr. Stretton, now a consultant physician in the Royal Infirmary, the man may have been infected as far back as the late 1940s when he was a teenager. He must certainly have been infected by the mid-1950s. He was 25 when he died. Between 1955 and 1957, he had been to sea, though Dr. Stretton says his records do not specify whether he was in the Royal or the Merchant Navies. He had probably visited the tropics, but no one knows whether he had been to Africa. He was unmarried, lived in a suburb of Manchester, and worked as a compositor at a printing works after his seafaring days. It was more than 20 years later, in the early 80s, that AIDS was first described. Dr. Stretton and his colleagues recognised the similarities with the young man's mystery illness, but they were able to confirm only recently, with a new scientific test, that preserved samples of the man's organs contained traces of HIV. Dr. George Williams, the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on the man, published the results of the most recent tests in last Friday's edition of The Lancet. But even now, Dr. Stretton and his colleagues will not reveal the victim's name. Quote, "He was an only son," Dr. Stretton said. "I am pretty certain his parents were alive at the time, but they were dead by 1983. End quote. Other medical sources say the young man had an elderly aunt in the Manchester area who is also thought to have died. Dr. Stretton describes him as, quote, "a man of medium height and build, with a moustache." Even with hindsight, Dr. Stretton says there was no indication that the man was homosexual or likely to have injected drugs, although he concedes that both subjects were rarely raised at the time. Quote, "Homosexuality was not something you asked about. We've seen similar anal ulceration in heterosexual AIDS patients. As for drugs, I'd be very, very surprised. At that time, drug users were a great rarity. Nowadays, we would ask people, but it was not a question you would ask then. If he'd come in the 80s, we wouldn't have been scratching our heads. We'd have said, he's got AIDS. End quote. Dr. Stretton showed the Independent on Sunday a copy of the original case study by himself, Dr. Williams and a third doctor, which was published in 1960 in the Lancet. The paper describes in great detail the agonizing and debilitating illnesses that the man suffered. It contains photographs taken at the post-mortem examination of large ulcers on the patient's nose and lips and around the anus. Quote, "You never forget a case like that. We studied him. He was wasting away. When you've got a man in his late 20s deteriorating before your eyes, at first he was up and about, going to the toilet himself. Latterly he was bedridden. He was a very sick man. He lost a lot of weight and was running a high fever. We knew what he died of. We identified pneumonia and a widespread virus infection. We speculated that he probably lacked immunity, but the whole concept of immunity was pretty much in its infancy then. He was asked when he came in whether he had any tropical diseases. The answer was no. The inference of the question was that he had travelled through tropical climates, but that doesn't mean he went ashore there." End quote. Dr. Stretton does not know where the man lies buried. Quote, "An undertaker came and took the body away. That's what happens." End quote. To many AIDS researchers, it is not a surprise that an isolated case such as this should have occurred in the late 1950s. Dr. Clive Loveday, lecturer at the Genitourinary Medicine at University College and Middlesex Hospitals, said he believed that such cases must have occurred, probably even in the 1940s. If it were practicable to look back through the archives and do the relevant tests, he said, quote, "I'm sure we would all find isolated cases of AIDS." End quote. People may have fallen ill with unusual infections such as those suffered by the Manchester sailor, but AIDS can also manifest itself with more common bacterial infections. For example, if someone with HIV infection in the 1940s or 1950s happened to go down with tuberculosis, which was much commoner then, the only remarkable feature about their illness might have been its particularly rapid course. Dr. Loveday said the Manchester case is very similar to that of a Norwegian sailor reported in the Lancet 2 years ago. In the early 1960s, he had visited foreign ports, including some in Africa. During this time, he twice had treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. He fell ill in 1966 with symptoms typical of HIV infection. His wife fell ill the following year. Both died of infections typical of AIDS in 1976. 2 of their children, born before 1967, were healthy. The third child, born in 1967, fell ill in 1969, dying in the same year as her parents. Tests on blood samples taken from the 3 patients and stored frozen have since showed that all were infected with HIV. The 2 older daughters were not. As far as is known, the only people this man infected with HIV were his wife and, through her, his third daughter. These cases, and the Manchester one, illustrate how there may have been sporadic introductions of the virus into countries such as Britain over several decades. Dr. Peter Dropman, medical epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, says there have been quite a few cases of probable AIDS reported that date back to the 1950s and 1960s. Quote, "It is possible that AIDS was introduced to industrialized nations several times before it began to spread. Probably some introductions petered out and did not cause epidemics," he said. Only with the onset of the sexual revolution did behaviour change enough to allow an epidemic to begin, because the virus would have had more opportunities to pass from person to person. Quote, "That may explain why it caused an epidemic in the late 1970s and not the late 1950s, Dr. Dropman said. One of the early cases he mentioned was that of a Haitian man who died of pneumocystis pneumonia, now recognised as typical of AIDS, in New York in 1959. Like the doctors who cared for the Manchester sailor, the Haitian man's doctors were mystified by his case that they wrote it up in a medical journal. Unfortunately, they did not store samples of blood or tissue for future analysis, as some doctors have in their puzzlement. Where such samples have been safely stored, modern tests for HIV have sometimes solved the mystery. Such tests confirm, for example, one of the earliest cases of AIDS in the US. The sufferer was a 15-year-old boy in St. Louis, Missouri, who fell ill in 1968. He died the next year with symptoms typical of AIDS. The doctors who reported his case in the Journal of the American Medical Association said there was some evidence that the boy, who admitted being sexually active, was homosexual. Until the Manchester case, the earliest known trace of HIV was in Kinshasa, Zaire. Tests carried out in the 1980s on blood samples collected many years before identified one, dating from 1959, that had antibodies to the virus. Whoever gave the sample has proved impossible to trace. He or she apparently received multiple blood transfusions for sickle cell anemia. No one knows, therefore, whether this person developed AIDS or died of the disease. One spin-off from the Manchester case will be valuable information to scientists who are tracking the evolution and thus the origin of the virus, according to Dr. Jerry Myers, director of the HIV sequence database in Los Alamos, New Mexico. He believes the evidence that the human immunodeficiency viruses originated from monkeys through bites, scratches or cuts is now, quote, stronger than ever, end quote. Certainly, the case rules out the theory that the virus was man-made, an organism genetically engineered and released from some laboratory either in error or even deliberately. The technology of genetic manipulation was discovered long after the young man's death. The discovery is unlikely to change scientists' views of the extent of the epidemic in Britain, however. Dr. Robin Weiss of the Chester Beatty Research Laboratories in London said, quote, "There is no indication that being able to trace it back another 10 years says that it has spread more than we first thought." End quote. It's interesting. Then, by the 24th of July, the story breaks in the United States of America, no doubt given their high rates of HIV infection and AIDS-related deaths. The story first appeared in the New York Times and was then republished in almost every newspaper from the East Coast to the West. Then, back here in the UK on the 1st of August 1990, David being the only child of Herbert David Carr and Agnes McKenna, both deceased at the time of this story breaking, a surviving relative speaks to the Stockport Express, where David and his parents were from. They ran the headline, "First AIDS Victim?" with the strapline, "Experts diagnose virus 31 years after Seaman's mysterious death," where they report. A relative of the Western world's first known victim of AIDS, who died 23 years before the disease was officially diagnosed, this week expressed relief that the reddish seaman did not die in vain. Quote, "We hope his death will help save others as a result of this breakthrough," end quote. He said, referring to the recent revelation that his cousin, David Carr, who died mysteriously in 1959, suffered from the killer disease. Revolutionary techniques used by virologists at Manchester University have made medical history by finding traces of HIV in samples of tissues taken by baffled doctors from David at the time of his death 31 years ago. The cousin, who asked not to be named, said, quote, "The family were absolutely devastated when David died suddenly at such a young age. He was just 25. He had led an active and exciting life in the Merchant Navy and was looking forward to a wonderful future. His parents, Uncle David and Auntie Agnes, are dead now, but they never got over the tragedy of their only son." End quote. David, a former pupil of Holdsworth School, began work as a linear type operator at the Manchester Evening Chronicle after winning a scholarship to Stockport College. After serving 4 years in dentures, he chose to join the Merchant Navy to do his national service. His ship regularly journeyed to North Africa, the place experts suspected was the origin of AIDS. But it was not until David returned to his home on Naseby Road in Reddish that his health began to deteriorate. The burly sailor, once a valuable member of the Reddish Rovers football team, halved in weight. Doctors at Manchester Royal Infirmary subjected him to 9 months continual tests but could not conclusively diagnose his complaint. They decided that he was suffering from pneumonia, but complications set in, and on August 31st, 1959, David Carr died. Cause of death was certified as Wegener's granulomatosis, a tumour or new growth of granulation tissue caused by inflammation such as syphilis or tuberculosis. But it was 31 years later that the true cause of death came to light when sophisticated laboratory techniques detected that David had died from full-blown AIDS. Quote, "It came as a shock, but at least we cleared the mystery," said the cousin. David was a healthy young man. He had plenty of girlfriends, and shortly before he died, I gather he had got engaged to a local girl. One can only presume he caught the disease during his frequent trips to Africa, and There was an incubation period of several years before it developed. There was 5 years difference between him and me, and it was a long time ago, but I do remember the grief in the family when David died. Everyone was shattered," said the cousin. Then all goes quiet. Until a little over 4 years later, the Independent newspaper on the 6th of November 1994 ran a 5-page spread on the AIDS pandemic. 3 of those pages cover additional insight into David Carr, where they ran the headline, "The End of Innocence," and the article by Simon Garfield states, quote, "Mr. Carr, we'd like to keep you in for observation overnight," end quote. On the 8th of April 1959, David Carr was admitted to Manchester Royal Infirmary, looking wasted, feeling feverish. He had managed to walk into outpatients, but the consultant on duty was certain that Carr would not be going home that night. A while later, the consultant realised that Carr would never see his home again. His blood pressure was normal and his lungs were clear, but the 25-year-old patient had many strange symptoms. He had an inflamed nostril and gums, an anal ulcer, and some scaly brownish lesions on his back and shoulders. In the past 5 months, he had experienced night sweats, breathlessness, loss of weight, tiredness, and a high temperature. David Carr was placed on an open ward and was examined most days by either Dr. John Leonard, the senior registrar, or Dr. Trevor Stretton, the senior house officer. Unexplained cases were not uncommon on their wards, but neither of them had seen a case like this. The doctors ran tests and offered treatments, but the tests were all inconclusive and the treatments mostly inefficacious. The initial diagnosis was tuberculosis. Hodgkin's disease was also suspected, as was Wagner's granulomatosis, a rare condition of unknown cause. But when the tests came back from the labs, they were all negative. So they were stumped, though they couldn't admit this to their patient. David Carr's immune system appeared to be simply shot to pieces. He became increasingly subdued, in great discomfort from his symptoms and wary from the examinations. Every few days they took more samples, more swabs, more blood, more scrapes, and yet he continued to waste away, surrounded mostly by older men with established conditions. His parents visited at the appointed hours, as did his girlfriend. They were engaged to be married next year, 1960. They couldn't imagine what had caused such a sudden transformation. David was their strapping lad, a robust footballer at school, a keen apprentice printer on a local newspaper. He'd never experienced serious disease before, and he had remained healthy throughout his stint of national service in the Royal Navy. And now, here he was, a medical mystery. All the experts came, the chest men, the skin men, the bacteriologists. He even attracted Professor Robert Platt, the consultant who later became president of the Royal College of Physicians. In the case notes, Platt wondered whether, now that bacterial infection was in retreat from antibiotics, if it wasn't possible that, quote, "the viruses are going to come and plague us," end quote. In the last month of his life, Carr developed fresh ulcers and bronchopneumonia. He died on the 31st of August 1959, 20 weeks after admission. His death was entered officially as Wagner's granulomatosis, but the autopsy revealed something else. Dr. George Williams, a pathologist at the hospital, had also never seen anything like the body of David Carr. It was severely emaciated and covered in small lesions and fissures. One of his lungs was partially collapsed and his spleen and liver were enlarged. The samples Williams cut from his lungs revealed cysts in a honeycomb formation, suggesting a form of pneumonia, pneumocystis carinii. The lungs also contained swollen infected cells typical of cytomegalic inclusion disease, a virus belonging to the herpes group. Considered separately, these factors were rare and seen most often in babies or small children. Considered together, they were practically unheard of. The doctors could offer no clue as to how their patient might have contracted such diseases or how these diseases conspired to kill him so swiftly. They wrote the case up for the Lancet, but when their report appeared, more than a year after David Carr's death, they received no correspondence. No one else appeared to have any ideas either. At the end of his autopsy, Dr. Williams stored some tissue samples, the way he always did. These were tiny sections, perhaps a centimetre square, sliced from all the organs. Williams took more samples than normal, about 40. fitting, he believed, for such a perplexing case. He fixed them in a formaldehyde solution for 24 hours, treated them with alcohol, embedded them in a paraffin wax, and stored them between pieces of stiff paper. This was standard and reliable practice and remains so today. With many cases, the tissue samples are disposed of after a few years, others become untraceable or mislaid. David Carr's tissues were not destroyed or lost and survived 2 departmental moves. And that would have been the end of the story. Another unexplained case in a regional teaching hospital many moons ago. But then, about 20 years later, young men began falling sick in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. At the beginning of 1985, none of the Manchester doctors had forgotten their patient from 1959. Such was the rarity of his condition. But their memory of the details was patchy. They had not seen a comparable case since. They had flourished in their respective careers, both in Britain and abroad. When news of, quote, the gay cancer, end quote, or gay compromise syndrome or gay-related immune deficiency, known as GRID, first came from America in 1981, the young doctors who had treated David Carr were in their 50s and had seen thousands of patients. Dr. Leonard clipped any articles that caught his eye in the Lancet and British Medical Journal, but the relevance of these early reports of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, to David Carr's case was not immediately apparent. In the summer of 1983, when the reports of the syndrome began appearing in the national British press, he was working at Manchester's Whittington Hospital. He called Dr. Stretton at the Royal Infirmary, quote, "Do you remember that chap we saw with pneumocystis? Do you know what I think he had?" End quote. Stretton said he did. Quote, "If he came in today, I know which test I'd run first." End quote. Leonard called Dr. Williams too and composed a brief letter to the Lancet. Quote, "Could our patient have had AIDS?" The letter asked. Quote, "He had previously been well. While in the Navy, 1955 to 57, he had travelled abroad. He was not married and we know nothing of his sexual orientation." End quote. There was little response, but the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta, Georgia, the organization that was tracking the epidemic in the United States, called Dr. Stretton to ask for some serum. There was none. Tests on tissue samples, if any could be found, would not be sophisticated enough to prove anything. The CDC asked Dr. Stretton to find out what he could about the man's past, but when he called David Carr's former GP in Stockport, he was told that both his parents had died and his fiancée had moved to Australia. There was an elderly aunt in the area, but Dr. Stretton was advised that she was frail and unlikely to welcome an inquiry of this nature, and so the matter came to rest again. In the next few years, the case came to assume even greater potential significance. As research scientists studied the evolution of the virus, several wild theories about the origin of AIDS began appearing. The panic and prejudice AIDS engendered completely destroyed local patterns of reasoning. Post-cholera, post-typhoid, post-polio, modern Western medicine could no longer be shocked by new epidemics. AIDS was no doubt man-made. Blame was the thing. Who was guilty? The CIA or KGB released a virus as a form of germ warfare or to rid the world of homosexuals. It was the will of God and divine retribution. It came from outer space, the virus from another planet. It came from recreational drug use. It came from a polio vaccine program. It came from telephone cables. In the 2 or 3 years after the virus was isolated in 1983, there was so little natural history, so little convincing etiology, that it was no wonder the crank theories took hold. The case of David Carr had the potential to lay at least some of them to rest, but his case appeared not to be unique. Also in 1959, an anonymous person from Kinshasa, Zaire, had serum drawn and stored which was shown many years later to be HIV antibody positive. In the same year, a 48-year-old New York clerk fell ill and developed symptoms similar to David Carr's: night sweats, fever, weight loss. The man had moved to Manhattan from Haiti 3 decades earlier. The autopsy revealed no underlying disease, but again detected pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. When Dr. Gordon Hennigar, the pathologist, was asked subsequently whether he thought the man had AIDS, he said, quote, "You bet," end quote. As news of these cases began to trickle out in the mid-80s, the Manchester doctors realised that their patient might hold the earliest clues as to the origin of what had by then become a modern pandemic. Dr. George Williams had managed to locate the tissue samples in November 1987, although it was by no means clear how to proceed. He contacted Professor Maurice Longson, the consultant virologist, with a view to identifying a possible HIV protein on the tissue cells. The standard immunological methods were still primitive and no such virus was located. The following year, Williams got in touch with Dr. Gerald Corbett, another virologist at the hospital. Corbett had recently become aware of a new American process of DNA amplification called the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, that might prove suitable in the case of these tissues. It was still an elaborate, time-consuming process which demanded rigid procedures. Sections were sliced from the wax blocks containing tissues from the brain, the liver, a kidney, throat, bone marrow, and spleen. A control patient of a similar age to David Carr was located, a man who had also died in 1959, in this case from a road traffic accident. All the samples were coded by Dr. Williams before examination began, and they remained blinded until the procedures were complete. The entire process, dewaxing, centrifuging, drying, resuspension with a range of chemicals, amplification, took several days. Of the 12 tissue samples examined, 4 were HIV positive. Decoding showed that all 4 came from David Carr. These samples were from the kidney, bone marrow, spleen, and throat. Tissues from the brain and liver were negative, as were all 6 samples from the control. The conclusion was obvious and devastating. Carr had been infected with HIV. There was much interest when the results of the test were published in the Lancet, but for the results to have value, many more questions had to be answered. Where exactly did Carr go on his travels? Was he gay or bisexual? Had he infected his fiancée? Had any of his shipmates shown similar symptoms? The investigations continue today, at the time of the article in 1994. His fiancée is well and lives in Australia. She believes her fiancé never had a homosexual relationship. In 1990, Dr. John Leonard wrote to the Admiralty for further details of his patient's ship movements and learnt that for much of his national service, David Carr was in Great Britain, at Chatham and Devonport, only travelling to Gibraltar and Tangier in February 1957 towards the end of his stint. Dr. Leonard's correspondent, a medical officer, noted that, quote, Tangier was and still is a hotbed of vice, where anything is available and discreetly catered for. End quote. Dr. Leonard believes his patient was probably infected by a prostitute, either in Tangier or further south in sub-Saharan Africa, if indeed he had travelled that far. It is not known whether he sailed independently of the Royal Navy prior to his call-up, perhaps as a merchant seaman. If he was infected in Tangier, the incubation period of the virus and his progression from infection to death, some 2 years, appear to be unusually short. When he was discharged from the Navy in November 1957, his medical records showed no record of any illness. The death of David Carr has further resonance. In 1992, Dr. David Ho was working as a founding director of the Aaron Diamond Center for AIDS Research in downtown Manhattan when he heard of a new and initially attractive theory about the origin of HIV. This theory, reported at length in the Rolling Stone magazine and subsequently in the national press, suggested that the large-scale vaccination for poliovirus in 1957 in the Congo may have initiated the AIDS pandemic by the introduction of simian, monkey, immunodeficiency viruses, SIVs. It was thought that the poliovirus might have been grown in simian kidney cells. These monkey cells may have harboured SIV, which entered humans through vaccination and then evolved into HIV. And we need to remember these are theories and opinions at the time of this article, which is 1994. Dr. Ho had been working in the AIDS field for 11 years. As a young clinician in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, he had seen several of the first patients who presented with many of the unusual opportunistic diseases we now associate with AIDS. He had previously done work on other syndromes that also lacked an etiology, and it was a natural progression for him to make HIV his speciality. It didn't take him long to distrust this new Congo theory. All his work had suggested that the virus dated back much, much further. The problem was, there seemed to be no way of dismissing it absolutely. He was appointed to a special committee to look into the Congo evidence, and it was then he remembered the Manchester case. From what we know of his travels and from what we understand about the incubation period, David Carr became infected before the vaccination program began. But much more could be learnt from his tissue samples. Dr. Ho wrote to Dr. Corbett at the Royal Infirmary about the possibility of acquiring some of the samples. Dr. Ho was surprised that although the HIV testing had been done, no one had looked at the viral sequencing of the DNA. This was crucial to the understanding of how the virus has evolved over the years. Dr. Corbett consulted with Dr. Williams, checked Dr. Ho's credentials, and sent him a small piece of embedded kidney tissue. Dr. Ho and his researchers worked on this through much of 1993. He extracted the DNA from the section and, using the same PCR technique, amplified the entire virus in several chunks. These pieces were then cloned and their nucleotide sequence determined. This sequence was then compared with current sequences from all over the world, in particular from North America and Europe. They were also compared to other sequences from monkeys and HIV Mark II, a less virulent strain of HIV located in West Africa and still mostly confined to that area. Remember, as of 1994. What Dr. Ho found in preliminary inquiries was that the virus from the 1950s was not very different from the one we see today, which suggests that these viruses have been going around for many decades and permits some rudimentary calculations. Dr. Ho believes that the divergence points from the chimpanzee virus must have occurred between 80 to 100 years ago, and the divergence from HIV Mark II and other monkey viruses must have been several hundred years ago. These are minimum estimates. Dr. Leonard, Dr. Stretton and Dr. Williams are semi-retired now and live within a few miles of each other in Cheshire. Dr. John Leonard is 67. His wife was a GP. Their 2 sons are doctors. He has told his sons that the young man he saw in 1959, quote, is the only patient that I've ever seen that will live in history. I shan't live in history, but the patient will, end quote. He says he feels rather pleased about it, but what gives him most satisfaction is the fact that they wrote up the case in 1960. Quote, if we had just shrugged our shoulders and said, oh, too bad, and done nothing about it, then I think it would have been forgotten. That's our only claim to fame, and then 24 years later to have realised that it was AIDS. I think that was good too. I don't think we had ever really forgotten him, end quote. Dr. George Williams is also 67. He still writes and does a little work at Manchester University. He says he wasn't at all surprised that the tissues tested HIV positive, quote, because it fitted so beautifully, but then the impact that it was the first authenticated case of AIDS in the Western world. That was exciting and interesting. There was also an element of relief and pleasure that the saga had been finally solved, end quote. He has had several requests for tissue samples since Dr. Ho began his work, including one from the UK, but he has turned them down, aware that any new research would squander material on the sort of initial investigations Dr. Ho has already conducted. But in February 1994, he did send more samples to Dr. Ho. Quote, I'm keeping a strict eye on this, he says. I don't want to lose it all. Having looked after the tissues very carefully so far, I have a pretty shrewd idea as to how much I can release for further investigation, end quote. Dr. David Ho's privately funded centre employs almost 70 staff engaged in a wide variety of scientific AIDS research. Situated across the street from the turmoil of New York's Bellevue Hospital, it is a serene, plush place, elegantly furnished, immaculately appointed. Dr. Ho is a rising star of the field and has published several important papers in the international journals, highly specialised areas, minute but critical advances. For Dr. Ho, as with most sober AIDS scientists, the prospect of a sudden breakthrough, a much-loathed layman's concept, is unrealistic. A cure? Forget it. A vaccine? Many years away. There is some hope, of course, but there is much caution too, the result of too many false dawns. This is the long haul. Every year Dr. Ho's people learn that they have so much more to know. Of the Manchester case, Dr. Ho says, quote, it's one of the fun things to do in science. It's somewhat different from the other projects we do, and this one has a nice twist to it. We think the sequence we've found here is real important, end quote. Gosh, isn't it a fascinating insight? And when you think, it is remarkable that over 2 decades later from the untimely death of 25-year-old David Carr in 1959 that the case still elicits intrigue, particularly as medical professionals grappled with the inexplicable causes of his death. And as a bit of a recap into David's symptoms, David arrived at the Manchester Royal Infirmary on the 8th of April 1959. David exhibited puzzling symptoms over several weeks, including malabsorption and sudden weight loss, often attributed to age-related complications. The doctors initially considered bronchitis, a common ailment also linked to age-related complications, while also noting the presence of brown scaly ulcers, lesions and fistures on David's skin, raising the possibility of Kaposi's sarcoma, a form of skin cancer associated with AIDS. Dr. Williams stated at post-mortem that he found honeycomb cysts in David's lungs, suggesting pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, another age-related complication, always often resulting in death, and that cytomegalovirus, abbreviated as CMV, a form of herpes, and as Dr. Williams stated, a condition often found in babies and not adults, interestingly stated today, Mayo Clinic state CMV is often found in HIV patients and those who have a compromised immune system. But the doctors baffled as to what was causing David to be so ill and ultimately what ended his life. In their paper published in the Lancet on the 29th of October 1960, they speculated that David's immune system was compromised. Again, a hallmark of HIV progressing to AIDS. Despite the medical community's lack of awareness surrounding HIV/AIDS in 1958 and 1959, the clinical signs he presented would now prompt a strong suspicion of the HIV virus. And as we heard in one of the articles, one of the doctors acknowledging hindsight, where they noted that had David Carr presented in the mid-1980s, HIV testing would have been the first step they'd have taken. And now, in 1990, comes a confirmation from preserved tissue samples revealing the presence of HIV. David Carr's story serves as a poignant reminder of the shifting landscape of medical knowledge and its profound implications on patient care. And at that time, although I suspect you and I feel it is not at all relevant, if not unhelpful and more stigmatizing, but David Carr is now considered the earliest patient to have died as a result of HIV/AIDS. I don't know what they call that in the podcast world. I think it's an outro or it's a brief summary to end the episode, but it's not the end of the story. Because, are you ready for a plot twist? Brace yourself because this is massive. The following year, the same newspaper, The Independent, on the 24th of March 1995, with a photograph of David Carr as a teen in his football kit, ran the front page headline, "World's First AIDS Case Was False," with the strapline, "Tissue from man who died in 1959 may have been swapped with patient who died 21 years later." Oh, some plot twist, huh? And you don't have to wait 21 years to find out what happens next, because I will be sharing the rest of the story in next week's episode. So all that's left to do is to spare a thought and raise a glass to the memory of Mr. David Carr. You can check out and read all the newspaper articles mentioned in this episode, along with extra snippets of information, on the Extra T blog. You can find the link in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Until the next episode, you can find me on Instagram at The Lost Boys of Soho.